One of Britain's biggest tech success stories undoubtedly has been financial technology, perhaps partly because we have some fantastic businessmen and businesswomen in this space, partly perhaps because of the UK's expertise in financial services and our experience of, long and historic experience of financial regulation. We've got some really exciting new fintech startups, from OakNorth to Revolut to Monzo, Starlingback. And as we discovered with our Tech Hot 100 list of startup founders, which was absolutely dominated by these companies, they rank among our biggest and most successful startups in terms of valuations. And it's an area where I think the UK has a real competitive edge. The potential for growth and for taking on the established banking industry is enormous. If you look at the way technology is transforming payments in China and in India, and how the pandemic has given a huge boost to this sector globally. But it's not all a bed of roses, because many of these companies are not profitable, and most have spent the past few years prioritizing growth over breaking even. And consequently, the past few months have been very tough for many of these firms, despite their rapid growth. So I think the question of how we protect and nurture this industry is a really important one for the UK, particularly since it is one of our sort of best shots at building global technology companies. And to discuss these matters, I'd like to now introduce the Telegraph's very own fintech guru, James Cook. James has covered this sector in enormous detail and is going to host our next panel on innovating with impact. Over to you, James.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you so much, Robin, for that. I think Fintech Guru, that will go on my business cards now. That's a very nice title. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm coming to you live from my in-laws' attic in Northern Ireland. And we have a really interesting panel of fintech experts. As Robin said, the growth that there is already in fintech is massive, but there's also growth still to come there. We still have incumbent banks, we still have legacy financial institutions, and there's a whole host of companies hoping to shake that up, work with them, work against them. And we're going to get into that topic today. Before I introduce the panel, I'm going to call for questions. You can ask questions in this panel in the chat function. You can also tweet them on Twitter as well if you use the hashtag TechIntel20. That's TechIntel20. That saves me having to ask all the questions. So please do get in touch. So look, thanks so much to our panel for joining us. I'm going to introduce them now. We have a really nice lineup and a mix of entrepreneurs and investors, as you can see them gradually appearing on screen. I'll start by introducing Rishi Khosla from OakNorth. It's one of the UK's biggest fintech startups. It's a B2B lender. They call themselves a next generation credit science platform, which is excellent tech lingo. And they want to build a better borrowing experience for the missing middle. It's growth businesses who are the backbones of our economy and remain so after the pandemic. Prior to founding OakNorth, Rishi was the co-founder of a financial research firm, which grew to 3,000 employees, and he's also an early stage investor in PayPal. So Rishi, thanks so much for joining us. We also have, if you're watching earlier this morning, you'll recognize her, it's Eileen Burbidge. She's a partner at Passion Capital, that's a leading early stage investment fund. Her fintech links are numerous and many. She's invested in Monzo, Marshmallow as well. She's also the Treasury's Special Envoy for Fintech. And she's on the board of Dixon's Carphone as well. So Eileen, thank you so much. And we also have our legal guru, not the fintech guru, that's me. That's Trystan Tether, who is a partner at Bird & Bird and their head of banking and finance. So thank you so much to our panel. I guess a great place to start is we have our own fintech CEO, Rishi, here. The theme of this panel is can fintech help build back better after the pandemic? Is there a role for fintech in this, Rishi? I thought I'd ask you the tough question first.
Sure. So, I mean, look, the fintech industry has already been a large conduit for a lot of the government lending schemes, like the bounce back loans, CBILS, etc. I think obviously the banking sector in total has, or the financial sector in total has put out £60 billion worth of the government lending schemes. And as I say, a number of players out in the market in the fintech space have actually been conduits of that. And I think very efficient conduits on getting that to the market. So when I think about the role that fintech's already played in the pandemic, it's been material. And if you think about on the other end, the convenience, the ability to do more online, the ability to do more on a remote basis is the way that all of us are going to lead our lives, and therefore actually playing into that theme with being able to live more of your financial life online is going to be an accelerated trend as a function of the pandemic. So I absolutely believe that the usage of fintech will go up. And when we think about, I think like was mentioned by Robin or yourself, so the fintech is such a prominent industry and sector for the UK. For us to continue developing it is so important to maintain that, in a way, global lead on this particular sector. So I think a critical sector for the country to continue sponsoring.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, thank you. What's really interesting, obviously, looking at Rishi and OakNorth, they have a lovely, well-appointed office behind them, but there's a whole host of new fintech startups coming through based in co-working spaces and attics similar to one I'm in. Eileen, you're a backer of early-stage companies. Is there a role for emerging businesses here to actually come in post-pandemic and start shaking up the banking world?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, just thanks a lot for having me on the panel, James. Really appreciate being here with Rishi and Trystan. But, I couldn't agree more with what Rishi was just saying in terms of the more established fintechs. But then to your most recent question, I still think there's a whole suite of solutions and products that should still be coming from even brand new startups as well. Rishi was talking about a lot of the support that came to the economy through fintech companies and collaboration. And I think there's also a lot to be said for individuals, citizens, vulnerable customers, and even individuals who wanted greater access to finance, more options for looking after themselves and their families, and more ways to save, for example, or manage their money, or to look after what they need to in the time of a global pandemic and when there's so much uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When we talk about fintech, one of the things that I'm always told is fintechs are nimble and they move fast. I know that Anne Bowden at Starling likes to talk about speedboats. Trystan, when it comes to a legal and regulatory point of view, how can regulators sort of keep up with that? It seems that fintechs are moving very quickly. Every day I'm told they're launching a new service. How can we actually stay safe and responsible and not sort of mess up the banking world there?
I think that's a real challenge, actually, James. I mean, I think one of the issues is scalability for regulators, because they're getting an increasing number of applications in all areas. I mean, they're not. It's not just the existing areas; that there are new areas being introduced all the time. We had peer-to-peer lending introduced. Now we've got something coming out of the EU saying they want to start regulating crypto assets, people dealing and providing crypto asset services. So you've got an ever-growing volume and an ever-growing range of different businesses being regulated, and I think that's a key issue. I think also these products are tending to be more and more complex, and very often they're in areas which are, for a regulator, they will say, well, how should I regulate this? Have I got the necessary tools? Have I got the laws that I need to regulate it? And then you've got to add on to that a lot of products have a significant data component, and they also increasingly have very large AI components, which means that regulators are having to think, well, actually, is this ethical? Is this something that we should approve of? So I think you've got quite a lot of challenges for regulators who are really being swamped by the volumes of what is going on, and having quite a lot of work to do in terms of keeping on top of it.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to come back
James,
on.
Can I just make a comment?
Please do.
Can I just make a comment to what Trystan just said? I think there's been a lot of focus on regulation and I guess support by the regulators for the very early stages, for how the sandboxes, how do you test new ideas, how do you actually launch new ideas, etc. I think one area where, as a country, we need to focus a lot now is saying, how do we actually maintain that regulation to allow these organizations to scale up? How do we enable them to go through the growth phase? Because fundamentally, I think the work done at the startup phase has been incredibly helpful to get momentum, but that doesn't follow through when you start getting a little bit of scale. You almost get bucketed to sort of the very high level of regulation that much larger institutions have. And I think that's actually an area where, as a country, we need to understand, we need to build that infrastructure, not only to start up, but to scale businesses.
Absolutely. Eileen, you are our Treasury representative and our conduit to government. What are you doing inside government to make this happen, and how does your role sort of play into that?
I think you're being too generous, or maybe it's another word, in terms of saying that I'm the representative, but I do try and be a conduit, and I couldn't agree more with what Rishi was saying. I think it's right that there's been so much great support for startup fintechs. It's been fantastic from, as Rishi said, the sandbox, and in terms of policymakers being really forward-looking and thinking about innovation first. Even on, regulated banking, for example, or it's setting up a small payments regulator and having, regulatory capital requirements brought down so that you could have new entrants in the space. But Rishi's absolutely right. There's then a gap, I would say, and there's a bridge that we need to fill in order to support then companies that go beyond that startup phase into the scale phase, but still maybe aren't necessarily the same as, say, a high street bank. And we do have this gap that we need to address. And for instance, I have the pleasure of chairing the FinTech Delivery Panel. We are looking at working with government and Treasury in terms of how we address governance and regulatory sort of compliance and regulations for that suite of companies or that cohort. At the same time, Ron Khalifa, of course, is leading this FinTech sector review. I would imagine and hope, that he'll have a whole section on how we can continue to provide more support from the policymakers and from the regulators to ensure that we don't just get people, off the ground and starting to fly, but then make it difficult for them to continue that journey and to grow into being, systemically important as we need them to be.
As Robin mentioned earlier, a lot of big fintechs and smaller ones too are not yet profitable, and for many that seems a sort of a way off. Is that a problem when we're looking at sort of fintech helping the economy and the recovery, that these companies are very often loss making? Is that something we should be worried about at all?
Is that to all of us, or should I take that as an investor?
Volunteer for that one.
I don't mind jumping in.
Okay,
go ahead.
I'll go, and then I'll get Rishi, the one who's actually making the money. I'll get him to opine as well. I mean, from an investor point of view, I think absolutely we need to see the fintech companies be profitable. We want them to be sustainable, and of course to have that long-term viability in order to support the customers and the programs that we've all just been talking about for the last few minutes. So it is important. I think though, it's important not to conflate two things. The fact that fintechs have been able to attract investment capital is not a bad thing. And the fact that investors are supporting them so much to say, try for growth and try to ensure that you can deliver the products you want without necessarily the pressure of profitability immediately, I think that's actually a good thing as well. And that helps innovation to flourish. But we do need to have a balance for sure. I would say also a lot of these companies, including OakNorth, part of the reason why its success is so commendable is it's not a very old company at all. We're talking about a sector and companies, that are just a few years old. And so there's still a long way to go.
So look, I would absolutely agree with that. I would say that the environment has changed very, very materially from an investor's perspective. We were in an environment where investors were willing to give a very long runway before actually seeing positive unit economics and sort of a path to profitability. That is sort of, I would argue, that appetite has reduced very materially in the private investment market, and therefore the runway and the amount of capital that investors are willing to fund off losses has reduced, which has necessitated fintechs and frankly any other businesses in the private markets having to have a path to profitability much earlier than they would have had to have, let's call it like 18 months from where we are today. And to be clear, I don't think this has been driven necessarily by the pandemic. It was a trend which got triggered, obviously, sort of summertime last year by I guess a very large failed IPO, and that just means that the path to profitability is that much more important. And ultimately, that is, like Eileen said, what creates a sustainable business going forward. And obviously, look, we're just scrappy entrepreneurs, so we just wanted to make sure that we could make money and stay alive. And that's why at OakNorth, we sort of hit profitability, cash flow profitability within 9 months from inception. But we did that just because we have a very, how can I put it, a very basic ethos on business.
I mean, on the regulatory side, James, I mean, I would say that one of the key issues here is maintaining trust in the industry, and it's very important that customers of fintechs feel that they could deal with fintechs more or less as well as they can deal with incumbent players, because otherwise that's going to damage the reputation of the industry. It's going to damage it for everyone. And I think that's where it's extremely important for regulators to strike this balance between, yes, innovation, yes, more competition, but also ensuring that customer funds are protected at all times. And I think that we have, of course, seen, we've seen Wirecard. Now, Wirecard isn't really a fintech, but on the other hand, that has certainly had an impact in terms of people being concerned about things that are happening within the fintech industry. And so I think trust is easily damaged. And I think regulators need to bear that in mind and regulate strongly. And it's quite interesting. We've seen the FCA has come out and created a series of new guidance, COVID-related guidance for payment services providers, and essentially designed to ensure that even if there's a failure, the customer funds are protected. It doesn't matter so much if investor funds are lost if a fintech fails, but it does matter greatly for the industry as a whole if investor funds are lost.
Trystan, I wanted to stay with you for a second, and I want to say the W word, which isn't Wirecard, it's Wonga. And we see a lot of fintechs at the moment sort of rushing through to consumer lending, and various investors have various headaches about what happened with Wonga, not including Eileen, I will hesitate to point out. Is that a risk that sort of innovation moves too quickly, and as people are wanting consumer finance, actually things can go a little bit wrong there?
Yes, I think that is a risk. I mean, I suppose at the end of the day, Wonga faces a very particular problem, which is it came up against the responsible lending criteria that were applicable, and it hadn't taken sufficient regard to those. I mean, in some senses, it was perhaps unlucky that its whole industry became so much subject of a kind of almost morally driven focus from the public, that it came under even more attack than it might otherwise have come under. So that's slightly unusual, but clearly it failed to get part of the regulatory approach right, and that was catastrophic to its business. And that's always a concern, that actually a fintech comes in and it thinks, well, actually regulation is something we just have to sort of live with, but actually it's really important to make sure that you do understand the risks that regulation poses for your business model.
Absolutely. Often we see with fintech founders this sort of anti-incumbent bank stance. I remember the TransferWise founders sort of stripping off outside the Bank of England and things like that. But it feels like over time we've sort of mellowed slightly. I wanted to come to Rishi on this one. He might look slightly startled after that sort of segue there. Is the success of fintech about sort of beating banks or working with them? How do you see that?
Look, I mean, if you look at what OakNorth's doing, I mean, in a very similar way to actually Paul and Ocado, we've sort of built what we would view as the commercial bank of the future. We built it with incredibly efficient metrics, highly profitable, and sort of low risk. And we're taking our technology and licensing it to banks outside the UK to make them better. So from our perspective, this isn't about, I mean, the market which we service, the commercial lending market, which we call the missing middle, we estimate to be about a 7 trillion market globally. And we're not saying that we're going to go and effectively solve the problem for the missing middle by ourselves. Actually enabling incumbent banks to become better and to evolve in our way is the way to get there, and a way to have a material impact on the overall industry. So, you know, from our very little corner, I would say that actually collaborating is the right way. But even within fintechs, I mean, Eileen obviously backed Monzo, and we partner with Monzo. We partner with other fintechs. So we just don't believe in an island world, if I can put it that way, but we believe in a much more collaborative world.
Eileen, did you want to wade in there? For Monzo to win, do incumbent high street banks have to lose, or is it not that simple?
Well, I think really boringly, I would agree with everything Rishi just said. This is probably the third time I've said this on that panel, so sorry. You probably wanted some more controversy or provocation, James. But I agree. I think collaboration is the way forward, and I say that, you know, you posted to me as a Monzo shareholder. I agree for the long-term viability of Monzo and what it's already doing with partnerships like OakNorth to offer, customers a whole range of services, but also just, with my Envoy hat on and in terms of how important the fintech sector is to the UK. For me, fintech has always just meant, technology enablement of financial services. That is not, at the expense of banks or the existing financial services institutions. It has to be in collaboration with them. You mentioned TransferWise as a really great example about, extreme marketing or at least branding in terms of what they were doing. They wanted to bring transparency to what they were doing. But obviously, every time you do a remittance payment or you send money abroad, you are going to settle at an existing bank account. And so there isn't one or the other. We can't have silos in financial services. It's not a winner takes all market. And of course, if everyone's thinking about customer outcomes, which we all are, there has to be collaboration across the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. I will be strongly criticised on Twitter, as I often am, if I don't mention cryptocurrency in a chat about fintech. And Trystan, I know this is an area that you sort of grapple with on a day-to-day basis. A lot of startups in fintech land want to do crypto. Is that tricky from a regulatory point of view? I'm going to assume it might be.
Yes, I mean it is, or it's becoming so. I mean, up until we've some proposals come out of the EU in relation to a much more comprehensive scheme for regulating crypto than has existed before. As it stood at the moment, all sorts of forms of operation with crypto have been unregulated because crypto is not treated as a form of investment, and so we've seen really an almost a kind of wild west out there, both in terms of issuing crypto, but also in terms of how people can deal with it, who can run exchanges. I think what is going to come, and what the EU proposal is definitely proposing to introduce, is that all crypto issuance will be subject to certain restrictions, but also very importantly, there's an even greater focus and much more stringent requirements if the crypto is a form of asset which gives some kind of ability to convert into either other assets, such as gold, or into fiat currency. And the key concern there is that if people are getting the opportunity to invest in crypto, which they feel has a monetary value that they can always realize, as opposed to Bitcoin, which is a kind of, if you like, more of a casino pricing. But actually, if they feel, well, I've taken this crypto, I can turn it into £10, then that is something which is much more appealing, but also people just simply don't perceive that they're taking an investment risk in doing so. And so the idea is to have a much stronger regime. And it's really referring to things like stable coins of the type that will be issued if Libra is successful, because obviously that could form a very major new payment device. But it's also equally important that if you've got all this money being issued, that actually you've got things like the reserve that are represented by that money always available, ready to repay if people decide to redeem their coins.
Brilliant. We have 5 minutes left, so if you have a question, please do tweet it with the hashtag TechIntel20 or put it in the chat. Otherwise, I will just fill the empty space, as I am going to do now. Rishi, crypto, massive thing. Am I going to be able to get a crypto loan from OakNorth? Is that coming down the pipeline with you?
Not anytime in the near future.
Why is that? Is it too tricky? Is there not a sort of benefit to the customers? How do you guys view crypto?
I would say I'm a traditionalist here. So I think you should stick with the innovators from a crypto perspective on this panel, but that's not me.
I wanted to come back to Eileen. We talked a lot about sort of challenger banks, but of course that's not the sort of totality of fintech. We see a lot more beyond that. Only on Monday I was writing about Marshmallow, which is a passion investment raising money. They are doing fun things in insurance land. What comes next after challenger banks? Is there another sector that we should be paying attention to after fintech?
I think I'd flip that around and say what isn't going to be affected, I think, by fintech, because I think everything that touches sort of commerce, transactions, and money is going to be part of this next wave of technology. What consumers have been seeing is a lot of innovation that really directly affects them. So first payments or remittances, as we mentioned with the TransferWise case and sending money abroad. And then, of course, banking or access to your finance, budgeting apps and the like. And all of this is because I think historically, if you look at sort of technology trends or waves over the years in the last few decades, entrepreneurs initially look to solve problems that they have realized or faced themselves. And so a lot of those are customer pain points. And we've seen that in fintech. And then I think you see after a few years, Rishi was always ahead of the curve, as is always the case in 2013, setting up OakNorth, looking to solve problems and for businesses. And I think that's what's still to come in terms of value creation for fintech and what we look at as investors. I think you're going to see a lot more B2B or enterprise and business problems solved by financial services technology. And that might be, technology that's servicing banks and servicing the financial services institutions. So a lot to do with maybe identity verification, KYC, AML, regulatory compliance, as we've been talking about with Trystan, risk and controls. There's a whole back end of financial services that still relies on really, really, frankly, old code bases, old technologies and old methodologies that I think could be modernized and really, again, to the benefit of customer outcomes ultimately.
I wanted to stay with you on that theme, Eileen. A lot of fintech, certainly that I see in the market, are sort of a lick of paint on top of aging systems. Is that enough just to make it a bit easier to use your banking app, or do you need the actual database and sort of engine behind it to be updated as well?
Well, I think that's an unfortunate reflection of maybe where the bar was before. The fact that a lick of paint is enough, and we've seen that it is enough to entice consumers to use different apps and new interfaces, means that they weren't happy with either, the customer experience that they were seeing, the ways they were told to interact with their own money in the past, maybe how they were getting customer support, and how they were able to, again, access their financing or the tools that they wanted to use. So to your point, a lick of paint or just a front end or just an app, even if it wasn't changing anything in the back end, was genuinely enough. TransferWise simply brought transparency to fees in remittances. And obviously it's built a massive user base and valuation from that. And then I think you're going to see more innovation, as I was saying, going further and further into the back end, which will be great because that will make everything more efficient. But yeah, regrettably, it's a reflection of where we were and how much work I think there was to be done, how little customer centricity there was before you had fintechs, as you talked about their agility and their ability to get to market quicker, before you had them sort of addressing these pain points. It really was just enough to change the front end.
We have 1 minute left. I'm going to come back to Rishi for the final question. Obviously, we've seen the landscape change quite a bit and demand change quite a bit over the past few months. Is OakNorth sort of ready for that challenge? How has that been for you guys, and how do you see the outlook over the next 12 months?
So look, for OakNorth specifically, we've credit approved something like £1.2 billion worth of new lending in the last 5 months. So we've been very active in terms of supporting our current clients and supporting new clients through this period. And from our perspective, we think there's clearly going to be a lot of economic turmoil ahead of us, and we're continuing to want to support British businesses through that period and enable entrepreneurs to actually get the capital they need to continue to grow and to weather through this period. So if I look forward over the next 12 months, we see a lot of activity here. On our software side, we're seeing an incredible amount of take up across US banks as they look at sort of the frameworks we have and the ability to get a look forward on their loan books and be able to effectively underwrite with that much more rigor through this particular environment. So on both sides, we're seeing a lot of activity and therefore sort of full focus on servicing our clients.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you everyone for making time to chat. It's always a pleasure to talk fintech, especially with these three. So thank you so much.